Opening a mysterious suitcase leads to a gruesome discovery.
She unzipped the suitcase, and the first thing that was seen was a human foot.
She just immediately panics.
The smell had to be horrific.
Yes, I need the police.
Police in 2 states work to put the pieces of the puzzle together.
We knew that we were missing parts of our victim. Why did you only take that part of her body down there?
I was like, well, I hope they find the rest of her.
It took a couple of days to complete the job.
But will they ever understand the motive behind it?
He was laying in the bed with her lifeless body in the room.
It's a case that stuns even the most seasoned detectives.
We've seen a lot of death, but some things you just see for the first time.
At what point did you decide that you needed to cut her up?
The efforts he took were horrifying to learn about.
I just put it in my mind to be like, well, could it have been somehow?
I just can't believe there's people like this walking around.
It was just pure evil is what it was.
It's July 2020 in Louisville, Kentucky, the Bluegrass State's biggest city on the banks of the Ohio River.
Louisville is the home of Muhammad Ali, where the Louisville Slugger was born, for the baseball fans.
We're considered a metropolitan area. I mean, it's certainly growing, but I think we still have a small town feel.
But this summer has been a trying time for the city's residents.
The summer of 2020, around the COVID epidemic, it was a lot of chaos, a lot of community disruptions.
It's also the summer of the George Floyd protests, and in Louisville, the murder of Breonna Taylor.
Breonna Taylor was an unarmed woman mistakenly shot and killed in March by Louisville police serving a no-knock search warrant in the middle of the night.
Louisville, Kentucky has really deep-rooted racism. It's been like that for the past century, and with the shooting Breonna Taylor, there's a lot of tension in the town.
The shooting triggered a wave of protests.
I remember the protests. We were down there for Breonna Taylor, and it was rough. It was really rough.
But now in late August, Shanta Alvis has begun to fear that another local black woman could be in danger. Her cousin, 31-year-old LaDondra Ellington.
Nobody had heard from LaDondra in over a month.
I think the last time they saw her was near the end of July.
I was inboxing her and calling her.
And after LaDondra's birthday came and went, the family feels they have even more reason to be concerned.
LaDondra had a birthday on August the 4th.
We never missed each other's birthdays, ever. But we didn't hear from her.
I kind of got worried with that because it was kind of unusual for her to go more than a few days without calling.
When more days pass without any contact, LaDondra's cousins take action.
She had friends as well who didn't hear from her, and they reached out to us. That's when we knew something was wrong.
They headed over to the apartment. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. And so that, again, raises more concern.
You can only think the worst.
Louisville native LaDondra Ellington had made a promising start in life.
We pretty much grew up in my grandmother's house together. She was the life of the party, always dancing around the house and just full of energy.
She was so genuine, so bright, so happy. It was literally like the best part of growing up was my cousin.
Everywhere she went, people were struck by her joyful spirit.
She was bubbly. She always smiling. She was very, very, very friendly. She was the light when she walked in the room. Then, like, when you go to family events, it's not right until she walks in the room. Long as we were together, then we knew we was gonna have a good time.
But after college, LaDondra's path took a turn that no one expected.
There were situations with her housing that got confused.
She ended up homeless and kind of fell into this hard place.
But that didn't stop LaDondra from fighting to change her situation.
One thing about it, she might have been knocked down, but she didn't stay down for long. So she was a fighter.
Soon, LaDondra was able to get off the streets and into a homeless shelter.
Hey girl, what you doing? Hey!
Being in that homeless shelter, she found a church home and she started to go to church.
I actually was about to head to Bible study. Do you want to go?
People who are down and out definitely have to have something to believe in. And with LaDondra, she was very involved in the church.
She never let those hard times crush her soul or spirit.
But her renewed relationship with God wasn't the only thing lifting LaDondra's spirits.
She met a guy named Melvin, who was also in a shelter. Melvin was from outside of Chicago, in a suburb area.
But like LaDondra, he had fallen on hard times and found himself living in the shelter in Louisville.
I'm Melvin.
As they got to know each other, they became more than just friends.
She told me she had met a guy, they had been talking for a little while, and she wanted to get to know him.
They made this love connection while both struggling in hard times.
Neither LaDondra nor Melvin let living in the shelter keep them down.
Even during this time, while both LaDondra and Melvin were in the homeless shelter, they still found ways to stay afloat, have some sort of employment.
Melvin had a series of different jobs, from working security to driving a truck that went around picking up donations for the shelter.
Then, in the spring of 2020, LaDondra received a Section 8 housing voucher for an apartment of her own.
She called me screaming, "Guess what? Guess what? I got my apartment." She was so happy.
To see her at her lowest, it was probably one of the worst pains you could ever feel that wasn't physical. And then to see her climb out from that and then actually get on her feet, it was a breath of fresh air.
She worked so hard to get into a stable place, and when she did, I was like, this is what we've been waiting on.
And LaDondra wouldn't be living there alone.
This was an opportunity maybe for Melvin to also find his path.
Are you sure it's cool? You know, like you staying here?
Yeah, I want you to.
But now, it's been over a month since anyone has seen or heard from LaDondra.
The family's concern just kept growing. Like, we know our cousin, that's not like her. So they just go and do a wellness check on her.
Nobody answered the door. Me and my brother left. And then we drove around looking for her at this point.
Instead of LaDondra, they spot Melvin on the sidewalk.
I think that's her dude right there on the scooter. We saw him on the scooter. So I jumped out. Hey man, let me holler at you for a minute.
But Melvin's response isn't what they expected.
His behavior was just really weird.
He just took off running.
"31-year-old LaDondra Ellington has successfully moved from a Louisville, Kentucky homeless shelter into her own apartment.
LaDondra fortunately ended up getting a Section 8 voucher, and she was so excited. She was ready to start her new life.
It was a joy getting a phone call saying, I got a new place, I'm ready, come over, we're gonna barbecue, we're gonna have a good time. She was just overwhelmed. And it was a joy.
And living there with her is her boyfriend, 30-year-old Melvin Martin Jr.
It felt like it was a good connection for her. Finally, she was able to find some true love.
But now, in September, after over a month without hearing from her, LaDondra's cousins have gone to her apartment hoping to find her.
We just wanted some answers.
There wasn't anybody at her apartment, but after her cousins left and were driving around, they spotted Melvin on the street.
Hey man, let me holler at you for a minute.
But Melvin doesn't stick around to talk.
He just took off running. I probably chased him for a mile, but that was as close as I got to him.
So on September 10th, LaDondra's family files a report with Louisville police.
Sir.
This was during a time of an uproar because of all of the protests against police violence and police brutality.
A lot of times, situations like this tend to get swept under the rug.
Especially in cases like LaDondra's.
This sounds like something that could be typical of a person with LaDondra's past.
With LaDondra already having a history of some homelessness, police may assume that maybe this is not a missing case, but maybe she's just dropped off the radar.
LaDondra's family is adamant that isn't the case.
She hasn't called, she hasn't sent a message.
It's hard for people coming from the outside looking in for them to realize that people are concerned about her because this is not what they're used to.
But it isn't just LaDondra's behavior that has her family concerned.
They also knew a bit of history between LaDondra and Melvin, and that there had been some disputes in the past.
They had issues just like everyone else. She would get away from him, he would try to come back.
I was aware of disagreements and things they had, but I didn't know to what degree it really was.
The family does know that LaDondra was tired of arguing with Melvin.
They had fights, yelling. Him mostly, her wanting him to leave, him not accepting the fact of she wants him to leave. She was just tired of the foolishness, and she was just over it. You only can take so much, and she wanted peace. That's all she wanted.
But Melvin and LaDondra had always made up and stayed together.
To the family, it seems possible that Melvin may have had something to do with LaDondra's disappearance.
Melvin's looking super suspicious.
And his behavior continues to raise red flags.
The day after LaDondra's missing case report was filed, Melvin goes to Illinois.
He hitches a ride to Chicago to visit his mother in the nearby suburb of Markham.
When he gets to Chicago, he calls his mom to pick him up.
When she arrives, it looks like Melvin is packed for a long stay.
She arrived with some really large suitcases.
What in the world? All this stuff. Here, let me help you.
Whenever they were loading the suitcases in the vehicle,
I can't barely even lift them.
it was remarked how heavy the suitcase and the totes seemed to be.
He told his mom that they were filled with dirty clothes.
At his mother's house, he doesn't unpack his suitcases.
When they get back to the house, he took his bags into the garage.
What in the world did you put in your suitcases in the garage?
I got some smelly clothes in here.
She's like, that just don't sound right, but she took it for what it's worth.
Over the next few days, though, Melvin doesn't do any laundry.
Despite having these two large suitcases with him, he kept asking to borrow clothes and even was asking his mom to buy him some clothes.
Now, she was wondering what was in there. If you were taking a trip, wouldn't you have clothes to wear? What's in those suitcases?
One afternoon, she finally has a chance to satisfy her curiosity.
Melvin asked his mom to give him a ride to the library. He said he had to do some work on the computer.
Mom is thinking, the first thing I want to do is getting that bag because he's just too protective over his luggage.
So after dropping off Melvin, she hurries home.
The bag is on top of a refrigerator in the garage, and she's first trying to pull it down. She said it felt like a sack of bricks.
Those bags were not filled with dirty clothes.
She saw a human foot.
In Louisville, Kentucky, LaDondra Ellington has disappeared, and her family has officially filed a missing persons report.
They hadn't seen LaDondra in over a month, and they weren't able to get in touch with her or her live-in boyfriend, Melvin Martin.
Melvin is in the Chicago suburb of Markham, Illinois, visiting his mother.
Melvin had brought with him 2 heavy suitcases that he said contained dirty laundry. But when he didn't unpack them, his mother suspected he was hiding something.
It has to be drugs, because what else could it be?
Melvin's mom decided to check the suitcases out while he was out at the library.
When she does, she makes a shocking discovery.
They were actually filled with what appeared to be body parts.
She just immediately panics. She's like, you know what, that's my son, but I just have to get the police involved.
Melvin's mother calls 911 and tries to explain what she found.
He was coming home. He was having some problems, and I know that he was having some problems. But he put that suitcase in my garage.
A detective is notified immediately.
I received a phone call from my supervisor, and he's telling me, hey, you need to go over to Markham. He's like, you won't believe what you're gonna see, but I need you to hurry.
The detective can tell what's waiting for him even before he enters the garage.
I first noticed the smell, and I'm like, yeah, this can't be good.
It's a smell you never forget.
And when the detective opens the bags, he confirms what Melvin's mother told dispatch.
This was indeed what appeared to be a human body.
Or at least parts of one.
It's the head.
Inside the luggage bag was the human remains of a female woman. They were wrapped up in a whole bunch of bleach wipes. There were some plastic bags.
There were multiple knives that were located inside the suitcase as well.
The scene is like something out of a nightmare.
Some of the body parts, you didn't really know what you were looking at because it was just a ball of flesh.
I'm like, whoa, okay, this is gonna get deep.
For the detective, the next move is to take Melvin Martin Jr. into custody.
At that moment, Melvin was not at the house.
He wanted to know, where is Melvin right now? His mom indicated that she had dropped him off at the library.
That's where the detective finds him.
He was immediately placed under arrest without incident.
Melvin is then taken to the Markham police station.
Authorities alerted the Louisville police force that they had Melvin in their custody.
I said, hey, look, I got this guy. He just came from Louisville, Kentucky. Okay, well, what's the deal? Well, he has human remains in a suitcase. And they couldn't believe it. They're like, are you serious?
Me and another detective, at that point, we got our bags together and we drove from Louisville to Chicago throughout the night.
The next day, Louisville detectives interview Melvin Martin Jr.
I asked him specifically about what happened to LaDondra. Why are we here today? Like, were things kind of just getting bad between you two?
It's a long story. It's a long story.
He starts by explaining how he had been living on the streets before moving into the homeless shelter.
He said he was noticing people following him.
I can't go nowhere without a whole bunch of people following me, looking at me, in groups of cars. People, I'm walking down this street, somebody coming down that way, they hurry up and run.
But anytime he would tell anybody, they were acting like he was tripping.
People aren't believing him.
But that changed when he met LaDondra.
Hey.
Melvin tells LaDondra that people are following him, and she actually agrees and believes that people are actually following him and trying to kill him.
So when LaDondra got her apartment, Melvin moved in with her.
But come to find out, they had an off and on, really rocky relationship.
He claimed LaDondra was a troublemaker and painted her out as a drug addict, a thief, and all different types of things.
Melvin says that LaDondra instigated all their arguments.
And did nothing help make me throw a gasket.
But he claims he put up with it.
Melvin says to them, he never hurt her, he never laid a hand on her.
So detectives decide to be even more direct.
They just simply asked him, hey, what happened?
You and I both know that she did not deserve what happened to her.
I know that. I know that. It's so cold-heartedly.
Why did you do what you did to her?
Melvin couldn't share anything but the truth at that time.
I lost control.
And what the hell are you gonna do with that?
Pressed by detectives, Melvin Martin Jr. has admitted that he killed his girlfriend, LaDondra Ellington, when things got out of hand during an argument.
During the argument, she wanted him to leave, and he says that she just kept going on and on about it.
I lost control.
He said that he snapped. What happened? I mean, physically, what did you do?
He said that one thing led to another, and he ended up hitting her in the head with a coffee pot.
It was a stainless steel coffee pot, and he swung that coffee pot and struck her in the temple area. Did she get knocked out, or was she still talking to you?
He says that he hit her over the head and she went unconscious. We didn't believe that was true, but we just let him continue.
Did you hit her more than once?
Yes.
He began to strike her over and over again.
He said that there was a lot of blood. Where was she bleeding from?
My head.
What did you do next then?
I tried. I tried to CPR.
Unfortunately, it was too late. She was dead.
How long did she lay there?
I couldn't even tell you. I don't even know. I didn't count the days, so.
He's like, man, she wouldn't get up. I left, I came back, and she was still laying there. This was for a couple of weeks, almost a month time.
LaDondra was still laying there in the bedroom the entire time.
Eventually, he made a pile on the floor, and LaDondra's lifeless body remained there while he slept in the bed.
Every night you slept in that room,
After weeks in the apartment, he decided to go to Illinois.
The only thing I could think about was about to see my family one last time.
But he didn't go alone.
When he decided to go home and see his family, he started feeling like he could not leave her there.
So you gonna come with me?
He asked LaDondra's body, talking to her, did she want to come with him?
I just put it in my mind to be like, well, you gotta come with me somehow. You gotta come with me.
How was the problem?
Melvin decided he was going to put her body into a suitcase.
He decides to take her into the bathroom and use kitchen knives to dismember her body.
He found 4 knives in that suitcase. Did you use all 4 of those?
How long did it take you to do all that?
I didn't count that. I don't know.
I mean, really, a kitchen knife is not going to do it, but he had no other tools.
Melvin told police that it took several days to dismember her body, and he was so disgusted with himself that throughout the process, he was throwing up.
It was really terrible. Really.
But he didn't take all of LaDondra with him to his mother's, even dismembered.
We asked him where's the rest of her, and his response is, well, I threw her away in the park. And we're like, what park?
Melvin told detectives he had dumped LaDondra's torso in Bingham Park in Louisville.
Why did you only take that part of her body down there?
I don't know. I don't know why I took that part.
With a full confession, the detectives ask for his opinion.
What do you think ought to happen to the person that cut her up and killed her the way she was killed? What do you think justice looks like for that person? I asked him specifically, what does justice look like to LaDondra?
His answer is surprising.
He actually responded something that I didn't expect him to say.
I want her dead. I really do.
Melvin Martin Jr. has just confessed to killing LaDondra Ellington, dismembering her body, and bringing parts of her remains 300 miles north to his mother's home in Markham, Illinois, just outside Chicago.
He acknowledged that he had killed her, that he had taken some of her body with him, and he had hidden some of her body in Louisville, Kentucky.
Melvin shows detectives on the map where he actually dumped LaDondra's torso.
While Melvin awaits extradition back to Kentucky, officers head straight to Louisville's Bingham Park.
Because everything was so overgrown in that particular area, locating the body was going to be difficult.
But law enforcement comes prepared.
I'm on the phone with the detectives who are out there in the park looking with dogs. I mean, they're looking, they're like, we don't see anything.
Fortunately, it doesn't take long for them to spot something.
Luckily, they're like, you know what? I think we got something here. I'm like, you sure? And they're like, yeah, we got something.
They were able to locate the rest of LaDondra's remains.
It's a hit. Forensics, call forensics.
Detectives now face the grim task of informing LaDondra's family that her remains have been recovered.
To get that message saying that she had died in that manner, nobody deserved that.
My granny's house was a gathering place for families. She was our rock. And when something major happens, we all congregate to my granny's house. And we were all over there. And that's when I found out.
My grandmother was heartbroken. It was rough.
I was broken, lost. I still can't get past it. It's surreal to me still. I'm in disbelief.
To find out more about their victim, detectives head to LaDondra's apartment where they speak with the manager.
He told them that she'd been a tenant for about 6 months at the apartment.
She came in as a Section 8 tenant.
Yeah.
So she's eligible to have just herself in the apartment.
Okay.
So then I noticed that she had taken on a boyfriend.
She had invited Melvin to come in to stay.
While this does go against Section 8 rules, the landlord said he doesn't really police that type of things, as long as they aren't disturbing anybody.
Melvin wasn't a problem. The neighbors weren't complaining. LaDondra seemed to be happy.
But recently, he had heard something concerning.
The landlord did recall two of LaDondra's neighbors having some conversations about they hadn't heard from her.
Last week, I heard two of my tenants out talking that they hadn't seen her in a while.
We went to the apartment and asked Melvin where she was.
The landlord had asked, like, hey, have you seen LaDondra? I'm trying to get in contact with her, it's important. And Melvin, in a nonchalant way, had just said, oh, you know what? She's out of town.
He said, I have not seen her in a week.
Okay.
But the manager adds that he noticed something odd during his chat with Melvin.
Get bleach and cleaning materials out, and he was mopping the living room area.
He noticed him mopping the floors with bleach.
After talking to the landlord, police start knocking on the doors of the nearby apartments.
The police decide, let's see if the neighbors have heard anything, just noticed anything unusual.
Do you know the residence in number 21?
Number 21?
Yeah.
No, I don't.
They hadn't heard anything or noticed anything unusual. They really didn't know LaDondra or Melvin.
They contacted a couple that lives below the apartment that LaDondra shared with Melvin.
We're just doing some follow-up work on some residents that live upstairs in number 21. He had actually called the police.
He woke up because he heard a lot of commotion, and that disturbed him.
He recognized the voices of LaDondra and Melvin.
He woke up out of his sleep because he heard Melvin beating LaDondra.
He was beating on her?
She actually would get beat by Melvin a lot.
A neighbor in the apartment below LaDondra Ellington has told Louisville detectives investigating her death that he'd overheard an incident of domestic violence between her and her boyfriend, Melvin Martin Jr.
What he thought he heard was LaDondra being assaulted or being beaten up, and he had actually called the police. Did they respond?
He didn't know if Melvin got arrested or what actually had happened.
It scares me to even think of what could possibly be up here, like I was right underneath it.
Investigators are able to verify what LaDondra's neighbors told them.
They run both LaDondra and Melvin's background.
And the neighbor's 911 call isn't Melvin's only run-in with the police.
He had a history of abuse involving other people, some criminal cases, as well as some protective orders, which are civil orders, but still just as significant.
He found the incident that the neighbor reported, but then there was another incident.
There was this one incident where LaDondra went to the domestic violence shelter and actually filed a report.
The report listed the date of the incident as May 23rd.
In the report, LaDondra had stated that around 1 a.m. she had gotten up to use the bathroom. And that when she got back in the bed, both her and Melvin had heard a noise coming from the front of the house.
Melvin went to the front of the apartment and he discovered that the front door was wide open.
Once Melvin closes and locks the door, he comes back into the room and accuses her of having another man.
You had him hiding in the closet, didn't you?
No, I swear.
He felt like she was hiding someone and that person, once they went to bed, that they had this grand escape from the front door. When LaDondra said that wasn't true, Melvin just slapped her right across the face. And then that's when they got into a struggle.
They ended up getting in a full-fledged fight.
It ended up with Melvin choking her. Until he said, you know what, get up, go sit in the chair. And that's when he just started sharing all of this past history of what he's done to women.
He was putting fear into her. He made it clear in that, look, when a woman did me wrong or I did really, really bad things to her, and she became ill,
LaDondra all of a sudden starts to have a seizure.
She said she ended up just falling asleep.
The following day, LaDondra knew she needed to get help.
LaDondra told Melvin that she wanted to go and visit her dad, and Melvin allowed her to go. And LaDondra ended up going to a women's shelter.
She goes to the shelter to file the police report.
But that's where the incident ends.
She never followed through, having Melvin detained or incarcerated as a result of that battery.
Many domestic violence disputes don't ever have a follow-up because police have to see if this is something that they need to pursue based off what the victim wants, or is this something that they're just gonna let fly by?
And unfortunately, in this case, it was the latter.
LaDondra found her way back to Melvin.
So, knowing everything about Melvin, the police officers go and get the search warrant to go ahead to search the apartment.
The crime scene unit sprays luminol around the apartment.
When we did that in the bedroom, there were all sorts of areas of concern that lit up blue on the door frame, the door itself, the dresser in the bedroom, the mattress, the floor.
Oh, wow. Not only were there traces of blood where Melvin tried to clean up, but there were also small traces in the sheets and in the towels.
The police have all the evidence they need to confirm Melvin's confession.
He was indicted on 3 counts. He was indicted on murder. He was indicted on tampering with physical evidence. He was also indicted on abuse of a corpse.
Melvin's attorney attempts to keep his confession from being used in court.
There was a motion that was filed to try to suppress his statement that failed. We succeeded on that motion. So there was a request for an offer, and we consulted with the family members and friends that were present, and we made that offer.
So they talked to us about the deals and the pleas, and honestly, at that point, it was in God's hands. It was no longer up to us.
The plea deal saves LaDondra's family from torment.
I was there when they actually gave him the plea deal. And I saw the position that my sister and her sister was in. There's no way they could have made it through a trial, having to see all the imagery and whatnot. So I understand why they accepted it.
We was able to speak, myself and her little sister. And as we said, it's in God's hands. What happens to him, happens to him.
Seeing my sister, seeing what she had to go through from making the identification and looking at some of those pictures, that's something I didn't want her to have to relive. Going through it once is enough.
But the prosecution has another reason too.
They don't want to go to court because they don't want him to plead insanity.
He was not mentally ill. He was trying to evade prosecution.
Melvin accepts the offer.
Melvin pleads guilty to murder. He also pleads guilty to tampering with evidence and abuse to a corpse.
He took 25 years on the murder, and then on the tampering and abuse of a corpse, he received 5 years on each of those counts.
Some feel that Melvin Martin Jr. has gotten off easy.
I think it was too light of a sentence. For everything he put into it, and the audacity to travel states away, I think, 25 years is just too little of a sentence. Slap on the wrist.
He deserves so much more. He deserved way more.
She definitely did not deserve that at all. No one deserved that. But his punishment will be far greater than we could ever do to him. Because we believe in the Lord.
Still, what Melvin did to LaDondra can never be forgotten.
This is one of those cases that is so heavy. It's just really different. And every little detail that we talk about, let's just bring back the memory, the The smell, the every little detail about it.
Here we have a domestic violence case, and unfortunately, it cost a life.
And the life it claimed was precious.
It's important to tell her story because I don't want her to just be a name. No, she was a beautiful person. She wasn't just a person who was murdered. She wasn't just someone who was in a shelter.
Everyone has their own faults. We go through things, but ultimately she was just a beautiful soul. She was just full of life and she loved everyone.
She had a will that you could never stop and still couldn't to the last days of her life. That's what I love to remember her by.
Abuse is never okay. If you or someone you love is in an abusive relationship, there is help available.
The Rebecca Blech murder. The road was almost empty that Sunday morning, a quiet ribbon of pavement cutting through rural Michigan beneath a pale summer sky. The kind of place where people waved at passing cars, where church bells carried farther than sirens, where children rode bicycles without their parents checking the clock every 5 minutes. Nothing about July 29th, 1989, suggested that it would become a date forever etched into the memory of an entire community. Yet somewhere along that lonely stretch of road, a young woman disappeared into violence so sudden, so inexplicable, that for more than 30 years investigators would chase shadows, families would wait for answers, and a killer would continue living among ordinary people. Cold cases often begin with silence. Not dramatic silence, not the eerie soundtrack of a horror film. The real silence is ordinary. A phone that never rings, a daughter who never arrives home, an empty driveway, a family dinner with one chair left untouched. That silence became unbearable when 26-year-old Rebecca Blech failed to return. She had every reason to believe the day would be routine. Friends and relatives knew her as energetic, dependable, and deeply devoted to her family. She was a wife, a mother, and someone whose future seemed defined by simple ambitions rather than extraordinary risks. There were no reports that she feared anyone, no evidence that she believed she was being followed, no warning that she had become the target of a stranger whose motives would remain hidden for decades. Investigators would later reconstruct the final known hours of her life with painstaking precision, examining every confirmed movement, every possible witness, every fragment of physical evidence. But in those first moments, nobody imagined they were witnessing the beginning of one of Michigan's longest-running homicide investigations. The search began with hope. Perhaps she had experienced car trouble. Perhaps she had stopped to help someone. Perhaps there had been an unexpected delay. Hour after hour, those comforting possibilities slowly disappeared. Then came the discovery that transformed concern into horror. Rebecca's body was found along a rural roadway in Dalton Township, Muskegon County. She had suffered a fatal gunshot wound. The attack appeared swift, brutal, and completely unexpected. News spread quickly across the county. Residents who had spent years leaving doors unlocked suddenly questioned their own safety. Parents called children inside earlier than usual. Neighbors who rarely discussed crime found themselves examining unfamiliar vehicles parked near their homes. The murder felt profoundly personal because it shattered an assumption shared by countless small American communities that random violence happened somewhere else. Crime scene investigators arrived determined to preserve every possible clue. Photographs documented the position of the body from every angle. Measurements were recorded. Shell casings, tire impressions, fibers, fingerprints, and biological material became potential pieces of a puzzle whose completed picture remained invisible. Every inch of ground mattered. Every overlooked detail could someday become the difference between justice and permanent mystery. Yet forensic science in 1989 was a very different world. DNA analysis existed but remained limited, expensive, and far less powerful than the techniques investigators rely upon today. Many forms of biological evidence could be collected but not meaningfully interpreted. Crime laboratories worked with technological limitations that modern detectives would find almost unimaginable. Evidence capable of identifying a killer might already have been sitting inside sealed evidence bags, waiting decades for science to catch up. At that moment, however, detectives had only questions. Who wanted Rebecca dead? Why choose that location? Was she specifically targeted? Or had she crossed paths with someone who hunted victims at random? Those questions shaped every interview conducted during the earliest days of the investigation. Family members described a woman whose routines rarely changed. Friends struggled to identify anyone who might wish her harm. Coworkers offered timelines. Neighbors recalled seeing vehicles but disagreed on descriptions. Human memory, investigators quickly learned, was both essential and frustratingly unreliable. Witnesses genuinely believed they remembered critical details. Yet as interviews multiplied, small inconsistencies emerged. One person recalled a light-colored pickup. Another insisted the vehicle had been dark. Someone believed they heard a gunshot. Another remembered only a loud popping noise that seemed insignificant at the time. Each statement carried possibility. Each contradiction complicated the search. Meanwhile, detectives pursued every logical avenue. They examined Rebecca's personal relationships. They reviewed financial records. They considered whether the killing might have resulted from robbery, domestic conflict, mistaken identity, or random violence. Every scenario demanded attention because eliminating possibilities was just as important as discovering new ones. Nothing obvious emerged. The absence of a clear motive became one of the investigation's greatest obstacles. Many homicide investigations move quickly because the victim and offender know one another. Statistics consistently demonstrate that spouses, relatives, acquaintances, or close associates account for a significant percentage of murders. Those cases often generate immediate investigative leads. Rebecca's murder refused to follow that pattern. If someone close to her was responsible, detectives could not prove it. If a stranger had committed the crime, identifying that individual became dramatically more difficult. The investigation expanded. State police became involved. Forensic specialists reviewed physical evidence repeatedly. Laboratories processed every item capable of yielding information. Each report answered certain questions while creating new ones. Reporters soon arrived. Television cameras captured images of patrol cars parked along quiet country roads. Newspapers described the tragedy in stark headlines. Residents clipped articles and saved them inside kitchen drawers, convinced an arrest would surely follow within days. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months slowly transformed into years. The killer remained unidentified. For Rebecca's family, time created a different kind of suffering. Grief alone is devastating. Unanswered grief is something else entirely. Birthdays passed. Holidays returned. Children grew older. Photographs remained frozen while real life continued without explanation. Every anniversary reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Every news report about another solved homicide revived hope that investigators might finally call with long-awaited answers. Hope, however, often collided with disappointment. Leads arrived from across Michigan. Anonymous callers claimed secret knowledge. Some reported suspicious strangers. Others accused neighbors. A few insisted they had witnessed events connected to the murder but had remained silent for years. Detectives investigated each credible claim because cold case history is filled with examples where seemingly insignificant tips eventually exposed killers. Most leads dissolved under scrutiny. Witnesses misremembered dates. Rumors expanded into elaborate stories unsupported by evidence. Anonymous accusations lacked corroboration. False confessions occasionally surfaced, offered by troubled individuals seeking attention or suffering from severe psychological disorders. Every dead end consumed valuable investigative resources. Still, detectives refused to abandon the case. Evidence remained carefully preserved. boxes filled with reports accumulated inside police archives. Interview transcripts documented thousands of hours of investigative work. Maps marked search locations. Photographs captured evidence that future generations of investigators might interpret differently. Experienced detectives understood an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, solving a homicide depends not upon working harder, but waiting longer. Waiting for science. Waiting for technology. Waiting for someone to make one mistake after decades of silence. Years passed, and the world transformed. Computers replaced filing cabinets. Digital databases connected agencies across state lines. Fingerprint systems became automated. DNA analysis evolved from an experimental investigative tool into one of modern law enforcement's most powerful weapons. Cases once considered impossible suddenly became solvable. Evidence previously dismissed as insufficient could now reveal identities with astonishing precision. Across the United States, cold cases that had haunted communities for decades began falling one after another. Families who had nearly abandoned hope finally heard detectives speak words they thought impossible. "We have identified a suspect." Each breakthrough inspired investigators everywhere to revisit forgotten evidence. Boxes sealed decades earlier were opened once again. Old reports were digitized. Biological samples received fresh examination. Microscopic traces invisible to earlier generations became meaningful through advances in forensic science. Some investigations experienced dramatic breakthroughs. Others remained stubbornly silent. The Rebecca Bletch murder continued waiting. Despite tireless efforts, despite changing investigators, despite evolving technology, no arrest came. The file grew older. The evidence aged. But neither disappeared. Inside climate-controlled storage, carefully preserved exhibits represented more than physical objects. They represented possibility. Detectives assigned to cold case units often describe evidence as patient. Unlike witnesses, evidence does not forget. Unlike memories, it does not change with time. It simply waits for someone capable of asking the right question using the right technology. For Rebecca's loved ones, patience demanded extraordinary strength. Every public appeal reopened private pain. Every anniversary interview required reliving unimaginable loss. Still, they continued speaking. They continued encouraging anyone with information to come forward. Because somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the laboratory reports and investigative files, lived a simple truth. A young mother had been taken from her family. A community had lost its sense of security. And someone, somewhere, knew exactly what had happened on that quiet Michigan road during the summer of 1989. The mystery endured not because investigators stopped searching, but because the answer remained hidden behind the limitations of its era. What nobody could yet see was that the most significant witness in the entire investigation had never spoken a word. It had been preserved from the very beginning. Locked inside evidence collected on the day Rebecca Bletch died. Waiting, silently, for a future that had not yet arrived. 3 decades is long enough for highways to be widened, businesses to disappear, children to become parents, and entire police departments to change faces more than once. Yet inside the evidence room, time seemed frozen. Brown paper envelopes, sealed plastic containers, handwritten labels fading beneath fluorescent lights. They remained exactly as they had been when investigators first carried them away from the crime scene in the summer of 1989. To most people, they looked ordinary. To homicide detectives, they represented unfinished conversations. Every item asked the same relentless question: what did we miss? Cold cases rarely die. They simply become quieter. The frantic pace of the first investigation eventually gives way to methodical review. Patrol officers move on to new assignments. Prosecutors handle different trials. Detectives retire, carrying with them memories of interviews that never quite made sense. But somewhere inside every department, there is usually one investigator unwilling to let the file gather dust. Every generation inherits the same responsibility to look again, to challenge old assumptions, and to search for details that previous investigators could not have recognized. The murder of Rebecca Bletch became exactly that kind of case. It refused to fade. Every few years, renewed public attention breathed fresh life into the investigation. Television stations revisited the story. Local newspapers published anniversary articles. Community members called police with observations they had never shared before. Some had dismissed their memories as unimportant. Others had been afraid. A few believed they were protecting someone they cared about. Detectives understood that time changes people. Loyalty weakens. Fear fades. Consciences grow heavier. One conversation can transform everything. But most of the new information followed a familiar pattern. Someone remembered seeing a pickup truck. Someone believed they recognized a suspicious man. Someone recalled hearing rumors shortly after the murder. Each tip demanded careful evaluation. Investigators could not afford to dismiss even unlikely possibilities. History had repeatedly demonstrated that extraordinary breakthroughs sometimes began with details that initially appeared insignificant. Yet they also knew that memory deteriorates over time. Human recollection is not a recording. It shifts, absorbs outside information, and unconsciously rewrites itself. By the time decades have passed, even sincere witnesses may unintentionally blend fact with assumption. That reality forced detectives to separate evidence from speculation. Physical evidence remained king. Unlike memories, it could be tested. Unlike rumors, it could be measured. Unlike theories, it existed regardless of opinion. Reviewing the original investigative files revealed the extraordinary scale of the work performed during the first months after Rebecca's murder. Hundreds of interviews, countless hours of surveillance, search warrants executed, ballistic examinations completed, vehicle records reviewed, firearm owners questioned, potential suspects scrutinized from every conceivable angle. The investigation had not failed because detectives lacked determination. It had reached the limits of the available science. That distinction mattered. Modern investigators often inherit cases from previous generations and occasionally discover obvious mistakes. This was not one of those investigations. The officers who worked the Bletch homicide had preserved evidence with remarkable care, recognizing that future technology might accomplish what theirs could not. That foresight would eventually prove invaluable. The physical evidence recovered in 1989 had been collected according to standards that exceeded what many agencies practiced during that era. Biological material was carefully packaged. Clothing remained preserved. Laboratory documentation remained detailed. Chain of custody records demonstrated meticulous attention. Everything had been saved. Everything waited. Meanwhile, life outside the investigation continued. Families in Dalton Township slowly rebuilt their sense of normalcy, though traces of unease lingered. Parents who had once allowed children to roam freely became more cautious. Hunters, walking isolated trails, occasionally remembered the location where Rebecca's body had been discovered. Drivers passing certain stretches of road still recalled newspaper photographs from years earlier. Communities remember violence differently than individuals. Even when names fade, places retain stories. Ask longtime residents about certain intersections, abandoned buildings, wooded clearings, or quiet country roads, and many immediately recall the crimes associated with them. Geography becomes memory. Ordinary landscapes acquire invisible weight. The location where Rebecca was found became one of those places. Nothing visible marked the tragedy. Nature continued its work. Grass returned. Trees grew taller. Seasons buried the past beneath snow, rain, and fallen leaves. Yet for those who remembered 1989, the road never entirely lost its silence. Investigators also examined whether Rebecca's murder could be connected to other unsolved crimes. Serial offenders frequently operate within geographic comfort zones. Patterns sometimes emerge only after years of comparison. State and federal databases allowed detectives to analyze homicides committed throughout Michigan and neighboring states. Victim profiles were compared. Ballistic evidence received renewed examination. Geographic patterns were mapped. Could the same offender have struck elsewhere? Could another unsolved murder share hidden similarities? The answers remained frustratingly uncertain. Some cases appeared superficially similar before collapsing under closer analysis. Others contained intriguing overlaps but insufficient evidence to establish meaningful connections. Detectives resisted the temptation to force patterns where none existed. Good investigations demand discipline. Coincidences happen. Speculation is easy. Proof is difficult. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, forensic science advanced at extraordinary speed. DNA profiling became increasingly sophisticated. Laboratories required smaller biological samples. Partial profiles, once considered unusable, became valuable. National databases expanded dramatically. Thousands of convicted offenders entered systems capable of identifying matches within hours instead of months. Cases that once depended entirely upon eyewitness testimony increasingly relied upon molecular evidence invisible to the naked eye. Every advancement prompted another review. Could evidence from Rebecca's murder now reveal something previously hidden? Laboratory scientists repeatedly examined preserved biological material, extracting every possible fragment of information using techniques unavailable during the original investigation. Sometimes results generated cautious optimism. Sometimes they produced disappointment. Cold case detectives learned to live between those two emotions. One promising lead could sustain months of work before collapsing. One unexpected laboratory result could erase years of frustration. Patience became their most valuable investigative tool. The Bletch family experienced that emotional cycle repeatedly. Every phone call from detectives raised hope. Every request for another interview suggested progress. Every public appeal hinted that investigators might finally be closing in on someone. Yet the years continued to pass. The absence of an arrest became increasingly difficult to explain. To outsiders, unanswered murders often appear abandoned. Inside law enforcement, reality is very different. Open homicide files never truly disappear. They evolve. Investigators rotate. Technology changes. Strategies adapt. Evidence is reconsidered. Fresh eyes revisit old conclusions. One detective notices something another overlooked. A prosecutor asks different questions. A forensic scientist applies a new technique. Success often comes not through dramatic discoveries, but through relentless persistence. By the second decade of the 21st century, another revolution had begun transforming criminal investigations. DNA technology was entering an entirely new era. Scientists no longer depended solely upon direct comparisons between crime scene evidence and convicted offenders listed in government databases. New analytical methods promised to identify individuals through increasingly complex biological relationships. The implications were enormous. A killer who had never been arrested could still leave traces capable of identifying relatives. Family trees, once assembled only by genealogists researching ancestry, gradually became investigative tools. Names connected across generations. Unknown DNA could begin pointing toward entire family lines instead of single individuals. Many investigators watched these developments with cautious optimism. The science appeared remarkable. The legal questions remained complicated. Privacy concerns generated national debate. Courts examined emerging techniques. Law enforcement agencies developed policies balancing investigative necessity with constitutional protections. Meanwhile, families waiting for justice followed every breakthrough closely. Each newly solved cold case offered another reminder that impossible did not necessarily mean unsolvable. Across America, decades-old murders suddenly reached courtrooms. Victims long forgotten by national headlines finally received names attached to their killers. The impossible was becoming routine. Still, every case remained unique. Success depended upon evidence preserved decades earlier. Without that evidence, no scientific advancement could help. Fortunately, The investigators who processed the Bletch homicide scene back in 1989 had unknowingly prepared for a future they could never have imagined. Their careful work ensured that biological evidence survived intact. That decision preserved opportunity. As forensic laboratories refined increasingly sensitive testing methods, previously inconclusive samples gained renewed significance. Tiny biological traces overlooked by older instruments suddenly contained measurable information. What once appeared incomplete became increasingly readable. The evidence had not changed. Science had. Detectives now found themselves asking entirely new questions. Not who matched the evidence, but who might be biologically connected to whoever left it. That subtle shift transformed investigative strategy. Instead of searching one individual at a time, investigators could begin examining family networks, geographic histories, and genetic relationships that stretched across generations. The investigation, dormant for years, began moving once again. Quietly, carefully, methodically. No dramatic press conference announced a breakthrough. No patrol cars raced through neighborhoods. Behind closed laboratory doors and inside secure investigative offices, specialists studied data that earlier generations could never have produced. Names gradually emerged. Possibilities narrowed. Old assumptions gave way to new evidence. For the first time in decades, the case no longer seemed trapped in the past. It was moving toward someone. Someone who, for years, may have believed the passage of time had buried every trace of what happened on that quiet Michigan road. Someone who could not possibly know that the smallest biological fragment collected in 1989 had survived every passing season, every administrative change, every retirement, every technological revolution. Silent. Patient. And now, finally, beginning to speak. Evidence has no heartbeat. It does not grow older, forget faces, or become distracted by the passing of years. Locked inside climate-controlled storage, sealed beneath evidence tape that had yellowed with age, the physical remnants of the Rebecca Bletch investigation remained exactly as they had been on the day detectives first collected them. For more than 30 years, they waited for one thing science had not yet been able to provide, the ability to hear what silent evidence had always been trying to say. The transformation did not happen overnight. It began quietly, inside forensic laboratories where technological progress was rewriting the rules of criminal investigation. Scientists who once struggled to recover meaningful DNA from degraded biological material were now extracting detailed genetic profiles from samples previously considered too small, too damaged, or too incomplete to analyze. Cases that had once reached dead ends because of technological limitations suddenly had new life. Across the United States, investigators watched an unprecedented wave of cold cases collapse under the weight of modern forensic science. Murders from the 1970s, disappearances from the 1980s, sexual assaults that had remained unsolved for generations. One after another, files once marked inactive returned to active investigation. Detectives who had spent decades believing they would never identify certain offenders found themselves preparing arrest warrants. Families who had buried loved ones without answers were receiving phone calls they had nearly stopped hoping for. Every successful case carried the same lesson. The truth had often been present from the beginning. Technology simply had not been advanced enough to reveal it. Investigators assigned to the Bletch homicide understood exactly what that meant. The original crime scene had been processed with remarkable care. Biological evidence had been collected and preserved despite the limited capabilities available in 1989. At the time, detectives could not know which samples would become valuable decades later. Their responsibility had been straightforward: collect everything that might someday matter. That discipline preserved opportunity. As laboratory specialists re-examined the evidence using modern methods, biological material that had once produced only limited information began yielding significantly more detailed genetic data. Each improvement in testing reduced uncertainty. Profiles became stronger. Statistical confidence increased. The investigation entered territory that earlier detectives could only have imagined. Yet generating DNA was only part of the challenge. Knowing whose DNA had been recovered proved far more difficult. Traditional law enforcement databases depend on direct comparison. If a suspect has never been arrested for a qualifying offense, and therefore has never submitted DNA into a government database, no automatic identification occurs. Detectives can possess an excellent genetic profile and still have no name attached to it. That obstacle has frustrated countless investigations. The Bletch case was no exception. No immediate match appeared through conventional channels. The evidence identified an unknown individual, but unknown remained exactly that. Rather than viewing the result as another disappointment, investigators recognized something important. They now possessed a reliable genetic profile. For years they had searched for suspects first and evidence second. Now the equation had reversed. The evidence could begin searching for the suspect. That distinction fundamentally changed the investigation. Advances in forensic genetic genealogy had begun reshaping homicide investigations nationwide. Instead of relying solely upon criminal offender databases, investigators could work with specialists capable of comparing crime scene DNA against publicly available genetic data voluntarily submitted by individuals researching family ancestry. These comparisons did not automatically reveal a killer's identity. Instead, they identified biological relatives, sometimes distant cousins, sharing only a small percentage of DNA. The process required extraordinary patience. Unlike dramatic television portrayals, forensic genealogy is painstaking work. A distant cousin might share less than 1% of the unknown person's DNA. From that tiny biological connection, genealogists begin constructing family trees. Birth certificates, marriage records, obituaries, military documents, census records, property histories, newspaper archives. Thousands of individual records slowly merge into one interconnected family network. The work resembles assembling a puzzle containing tens of thousands of pieces without knowing what the completed picture should look like. Weeks become months. Months sometimes become years. Every branch of the family tree must be verified. Every generation documented. Every possible relationship examined. One incorrect assumption can send an investigation in the wrong direction. Detectives assigned to the Rebecca Bletch case understood that this was not a shortcut. It was simply another investigative tool. The evidence still needed to withstand scrutiny inside a courtroom. Genealogical research alone cannot convict anyone. It merely points investigators toward individuals who deserve closer examination. Every subsequent step must rely upon independently verified evidence. As genealogists reconstructed increasingly complex family relationships, investigators narrowed their focus. Potential family lines emerged. Some relatives had lived nowhere near Michigan. Others had no conceivable connection to the case. Certain branches were eliminated entirely. The process resembled slowly reducing a massive forest into a single path. One generation, then another, then another. Eventually, detectives found themselves examining individuals whose age, location, and life history deserved closer attention. Background investigations intensified. Employment records, residential histories, vehicle registrations, known associates, travel patterns. Everything was reviewed through the lens of evidence rather than speculation. No assumptions, no shortcuts, only verification. The passage of more than 30 years created unique investigative challenges. People had moved repeatedly. Employers no longer existed. Witnesses had died. Memories had faded beyond usefulness. Records had been archived, digitized, or lost altogether. Investigators often found themselves reconstructing ordinary lives from fragments scattered across decades. Each document mattered. Each timeline required precision. Some names gradually disappeared from consideration. Others remained. One individual, in particular, appeared increasingly difficult to ignore. His background placed him within geographic reach of the investigation during the relevant period. His age aligned. Certain aspects of his history drew attention. None of those factors proved guilt, but together they justified deeper examination. Experienced detectives know the danger of confirmation bias. Once investigators begin focusing upon a particular suspect, there is always a risk of interpreting every new fact through that assumption. Responsible homicide investigations guard against exactly that mistake. Evidence must lead. Theory follows, not the other way around. As surveillance and background research continued, detectives understood that modern forensic investigations often require one final piece of confirmation. Reference DNA. The unknown genetic profile recovered from preserved evidence needed direct comparison against DNA unquestionably belonging to the emerging suspect. Obtaining that comparison required careful planning. Investigators could seek a voluntary sample. They could pursue legal authority depending upon available evidence. Or, under appropriate legal circumstances, they could recover DNA discarded in public after an individual abandoned any reasonable expectation of privacy. Each option demanded strict adherence to constitutional protections and evidentiary standards. Mistakes at this stage could jeopardize years of investigative work. Patience remained essential. Meanwhile, the suspect, if investigators were correct, continued living an ordinary life. Perhaps working. Perhaps spending time with family. Perhaps believing that whatever happened in the summer of 1989 had disappeared forever beneath the weight of time. That illusion has undone many offenders. Time creates confidence. Confidence creates carelessness. The longer someone avoids suspicion, the easier it becomes to believe justice has been permanently escaped. Cold case investigators understand something offenders often forget. Evidence does not become weaker simply because years have passed. In many cases, it becomes stronger. Laboratories improve. Computers accelerate analysis. Scientific understanding expands. The future often becomes the greatest enemy of yesterday's criminal. Throughout the investigation, detectives remained careful not to reveal unnecessary details publicly. Operational secrecy protected both the investigation and the integrity of future prosecution. Public announcements could alert suspects, influence witnesses, or contaminate evidence. Every decision reflected decades of experience handling major homicide cases. Behind closed doors, momentum continued building. The genetic profile, the genealogical research, the background investigation, the historical records. Each independent line of inquiry slowly converged toward the same destination. Detectives who had inherited the case from previous generations found themselves approaching something their predecessors had spent decades pursuing. Not certainty, but proximity. For the first time since Rebecca Bletch lost her life on that quiet Michigan roadway, investigators could begin envisioning a specific individual rather than an unknown silhouette. Still, professional caution prevailed. Every homicide detective understands that the most dangerous moment in an investigation often comes just before an arrest. Assumptions become tempting. Excitement grows. Pressure increases. Yet courtrooms demand proof, not optimism. One unresolved question remained. Will the suspect's DNA conclusively match the biological evidence preserved since 1989? The answer would determine whether more than 3 decades of patient investigation had finally reached its destination, or whether the search would once again disappear into uncertainty. Somewhere outside the public eye, investigators prepared for the comparison that could change everything. A comparison between a modern DNA sample and biological evidence collected on the day Rebecca Bletch was murdered. A comparison capable of reaching across more than 30 years. A comparison that would either eliminate a suspect completely or give a name to the unknown presence that had haunted one of Michigan's longest-running unsolved homicide investigations since the summer morning when an ordinary road became the scene of an extraordinary crime. There is a peculiar tension that exists only in cold case investigations. It is the moment when decades of uncertainty begin narrowing toward a single possibility, yet no one inside the investigation is willing to celebrate. Detectives have learned this lesson the hard way. Promising suspects have vanished before. Strong theories have collapsed under scrutiny. Laboratory results have overturned months of painstaking work with a single unexpected finding. Experience teaches restraint. The investigators handling Rebecca Bletch's case knew they had reached one of those moments. The evidence had led them farther than anyone had expected. Now it demanded absolute certainty. The genetic profile recovered from the preserved evidence had already survived repeated scientific review. Independent analysts had verified the laboratory procedures. Quality control measures eliminated concerns about contamination. Every stage of testing had been documented with extraordinary care because everyone involved understood the significance of what might follow. The science had to withstand not only public attention, but also the relentless examination of defense attorneys, forensic experts, judges, and ultimately a jury. A DNA profile is powerful. A DNA profile alone is not the entire case. Detectives still needed to establish that the individual identified through genealogical research was, in fact, the person whose biological material had been recovered during the homicide investigation. That meant obtaining a direct comparison. Investigators quietly intensified surveillance. Unlike the dramatic stakeouts portrayed in crime dramas, real surveillance is defined by patience rather than excitement. Hours pass with nothing happening. Days blur together. Detectives document routine movements, establish daily patterns, and wait for opportunities created by ordinary life. The suspect, if the investigation was correct, had no reason to believe law enforcement had returned to a crime committed more than 30 years earlier. He went about his routine. He drove familiar roads. He visited businesses. He interacted with friends and family. Nothing outwardly suggested that investigators were watching. One of the most remarkable realities of modern homicide investigations is how much DNA people unknowingly leave behind. A coffee cup placed into a trash bin. A discarded napkin. A cigarette butt. A plastic bottle. A drinking straw. Objects touched briefly before being abandoned can contain biological material sufficient for sophisticated forensic analysis, provided investigators recover them legally and preserve them correctly. Every decision required careful legal review. Constitutional protections remain essential regardless of how serious the crime may be. Experienced investigators know that an improperly obtained sample can jeopardize years of work. Eventually, detectives obtained biological material suitable for comparison. The sample was submitted to the laboratory under strict chain of custody procedures. No shortcuts. No assumptions. Only science. Forensic analysts began the comparison. Inside the laboratory, there was no dramatic music. No emotional speeches. No detectives pacing nervously outside the examination room. The process was clinical, objective, repeatable. Scientists compared genetic markers, one by one. Every locus examined independently. Every result verified. Modern DNA profiling does not rely upon a single characteristic. Instead, analysts compare numerous genetic locations across the human genome. The probability that two unrelated individuals share identical profiles across all tested markers becomes astronomically small. As the comparison progressed, uncertainty steadily disappeared. Marker after marker aligned. Statistical confidence increased. The unknown biological profile preserved since 1989 and the newly obtained reference sample originated from the same individual. After more than 3 decades, the evidence finally had a name. For investigators who had devoted years of their careers to the case, the moment carried enormous significance. Yet the work was far from complete. Identifying a suspect is not synonymous with proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Detectives immediately shifted their attention toward corroboration. Every historical record connected to the suspect required renewed examination. Where had he lived in 1989? What vehicles had he owned? Who knew him during that period? Could anyone place him near the area where Rebecca Bletch was killed? Did old employment records reveal relevant movements? Were there statements made decades earlier that deserved fresh interpretation? Investigators reopened interview files from the original investigation. Names that had remained buried in side paper folders for decades suddenly became relevant once again. Witnesses were located where possible. Some had relocated to other states. Others had passed away. Those still living often struggled to remember details from more than 30 years earlier. That was expected. Memory fades. Documents endure. Historical records became increasingly valuable. Old drivers' license information, property transactions, employment histories, vehicle registrations, telephone directories, archived newspaper articles. Each record helped reconstruct the suspect's life during the summer of 1989. The picture that emerged was not built upon one dramatic discovery. It was assembled through hundreds of ordinary facts. Investigators often describe successful prosecutions as brick walls. Every verified fact represents another brick. No single brick supports the entire structure. Together, they become difficult to challenge. Meanwhile, prosecutors began reviewing the growing body of evidence. Charging a decades-old homicide presents unique legal challenges. Witnesses become unavailable. Physical evidence may have degraded. Defense attorneys frequently argue that delayed prosecutions prevent fair trials because memories have faded. Prosecutors therefore evaluate cold cases with exceptional care. Every piece of evidence must remain reliable despite the passage of time. The Rebecca Bletch investigation had one enormous advantage. The physical evidence had been preserved with remarkable professionalism. Chain of custody documentation remained intact. Laboratory procedures were thoroughly recorded. Advances in forensic science strengthened the evidentiary value rather than weakening it. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation had never truly stopped. Detectives over the decades had continued reviewing leads, preserving evidence, and documenting every significant development. That continuity demonstrated diligence rather than neglect. Even so, investigators resisted the temptation to rely exclusively upon DNA. History contains examples where biological evidence answered one question while raising another. Could DNA have been transferred indirectly? Was there an innocent explanation for its presence? Could contamination be ruled out? Every alternative explanation required careful examination. Professional investigators actively challenge their own conclusions. If a theory survives every attempt to disprove it, confidence grows stronger. If it collapses, better to discover that before entering a courtroom. The evidence in this investigation continued surviving scrutiny. Nothing suggested accidental transfer. Nothing indicated laboratory contamination. Nothing contradicted the genetic findings. Instead, independent lines of evidence increasingly supported one another. While detectives prepared the case, Rebecca's family waited. For them, time had always moved differently. More than 30 years earlier, they had buried a daughter, a wife, a mother. The calendar kept turning. Life demanded that birthdays be celebrated, holidays observed, children raised, careers built. Yet grief never completely surrendered its place. Every family touched by an unsolved homicide learns to live with two parallel realities. One is ordinary life. The other is permanent absence. The possibility that investigators had finally identified the person responsible stirred emotions almost impossible to describe. Hope. Relief. Disbelief. Caution. After decades of disappointment, optimism itself became difficult. Many families in similar situations describe fearing good news because they have learned how easily hope can disappear. Investigators understood those emotions. They communicated carefully. They avoided promises. They discussed evidence rather than certainty. Justice demands patience even when answers finally appear close. Behind the scenes, prosecutors and detectives continued preparing for what could become one of the most significant developments in the history of the investigation. Search warrants were considered where legally appropriate. Additional forensic examinations reviewed earlier conclusions in light of newly identified information. Every report underwent careful evaluation. Every timeline was reconstructed again. Nothing was accepted simply because it had been accepted before. One of the defining characteristics of successful cold case investigations is humility. Good investigators understand that previous assumptions may be incomplete. New evidence deserves fresh thinking. The identification of a suspect transformed not only the future of the case, but also its past. Events that once appeared disconnected could now be reconsidered through an entirely different lens. Old witness statements acquired new context. Geographic movements became more meaningful. Relationships, once overlooked, deserved renewed examination. The investigation evolved from asking who committed the crime to asking how the crime unfolded. Despite the extraordinary scientific breakthrough, one haunting question remained stubbornly unanswered. Why? Why Rebecca? Why that place? Why that morning? Modern forensic science can identify individuals with astonishing precision. It cannot always explain motive. Human behavior often remains more complex than physical evidence. Detectives could establish identity. They could reconstruct movements. They could analyze timelines. But understanding what passed through the killer's mind on that July morning remained one of the most difficult challenges of all. As investigators assembled the final pieces of their case, they knew the coming months would determine whether more than 3 decades of unanswered questions would finally reach a courtroom. The science had spoken. The evidence had survived. The unknown DNA profile was no longer unknown. Now the investigation faced its next decisive step, the moment when years of patient forensic work would leave the laboratory and enter the justice system, where every conclusion would be tested under oath and every fact examined before the public for the first time in more than a generation. For decades, the case had existed inside filing cabinets, evidence lockers, and the memories of investigators who refused to forget. Now, for the first time since the summer of 1989, it was preparing to move into a courtroom. The transition from investigation to prosecution is one of the most delicate stages in any homicide case, especially one that has survived more than 30 years. Detectives search for the truth. Prosecutors must prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Between those two missions lies a meticulous process in which every document, every photograph, every laboratory report, and every witness is examined with extraordinary care. The case against the suspect would not rest on emotion. It would rest on evidence. The biological evidence that had remained silent for decades had become the foundation of the investigation, but prosecutors understood that juries rarely decide complex homicide cases on one piece of evidence alone. Every successful prosecution resembles a mosaic. Remove one tile, and the picture remains recognizable because dozens of others continue supporting the same conclusion. Investigators returned once more to the beginning. The original crime scene photographs were reviewed with modern eyes. Every image captured in July 1989 carried information beyond what detectives had been able to appreciate at the time. Digital enhancement allowed photographs to be enlarged without sacrificing important detail. Shadows could be examined more carefully. Distances could be measured more accurately. Small features that had once required magnifying glasses now appeared clearly on high-resolution computer screens. Technology had not changed the photographs. It had changed the investigators' ability to study them. The physical evidence followed the same pattern. Items preserved inside sealed containers underwent renewed examination using forensic methods unavailable when the murder occurred. Trace evidence specialists revisited fibers, hairs, and other microscopic materials collected from the scene. Firearms experts reviewed ballistic documentation preserved from the original investigation. Even findings that did not identify the killer directly helped eliminate alternative explanations and strengthen the overall reconstruction of events. Every discipline contributed another layer of certainty. At the same time, detectives reconstructed the suspect's life during the late 1980s with remarkable precision. Old employment records, residential addresses, driver's license information, vehicle ownership histories, telephone listings, financial documents that had survived inside archives. The objective was not simply to place him in Michigan during the relevant period. Prosecutors needed a complete, fact-based understanding of his circumstances before, during, and after the murder. Cold case investigations often resemble archaeology. Each layer uncovered reveals another beneath it. One document leads to another. One interview uncovers forgotten names. One archived newspaper article points investigators toward records no one had considered important decades earlier. The process is slow because accuracy matters more than speed. Investigators also revisited witnesses interviewed during the original investigation. Some conversations prove heartbreaking. Several individuals who had once provided valuable information had died long before the renewed investigation began. Others had reached advanced age and struggled to remember details from more than 30 years earlier. Detectives approached those interviews with patience, recognizing that memory fades while trauma often remains surprisingly vivid. A few witnesses still remember the fear that swept through the community. They remembered locking doors that had never been locked before. They remembered parents refusing to let children play alone. They remembered conversations inside grocery stores, churches, and neighborhood gatherings where everyone repeated the same question. Who could have done this? That question had echoed through Muskegon County for a generation. Now, investigators believed they finally had an answer. Still, prosecutors anticipated the defense's arguments. The passage of time itself would almost certainly become a central issue. Why had it taken more than 3 decades to make an arrest? Could memory still be trusted? Had evidence deteriorated? Could contamination have occurred? Every anticipated challenge demanded a documented response. Fortunately, many of those answers had already been preserved within the investigative record. The chain of custody surrounding the biological evidence remained intact from 1989 onward. Every transfer had been recorded. Every laboratory examination documented. Every seal accounted for. That meticulous record-keeping became almost as important as the evidence itself. Without confidence in preservation, scientific conclusions become vulnerable. With proper documentation, decades-old evidence can remain extraordinarily persuasive. Forensic experts prepared to explain complicated scientific principles in language ordinary jurors could understand. DNA is often described as a genetic fingerprint, but the comparison is imperfect. Unlike traditional fingerprints, DNA analysis relies upon statistical probabilities calculated across numerous genetic markers. Experts would need to explain not only how profiles are developed, but why the probability of 2 unrelated individuals sharing the same profile is extraordinarily remote. Science alone, however, rarely tells an entire story. Jurors also seek context. Investigators therefore reconstructed the chronology of the homicide as completely as possible. The known movements of Rebecca Bletch, the location where she was found, the physical evidence recovered, the sequence established through forensic examination. Every confirmed fact became part of a narrative grounded in documentation rather than speculation. One question remained especially difficult: motive. Investigators searched once again through decades of reports, interviews, and background information, hoping to uncover a definitive explanation for why Rebecca had been killed. No single answer emerged. This is one of the uncomfortable realities of homicide investigations. Not every murder reveals a motive that can be proven. Sometimes investigators identify the offender while the reason remains known only to the person responsible. Courts do not require prosecutors to establish motive beyond all doubt. They require proof of guilt. Still, jurors naturally ask why. Why this victim? Why this location? Why that morning in July? Those questions lingered over the investigation, even as scientific evidence became increasingly compelling. Meanwhile, the news of the impending prosecution began reaching the public. For younger residents of Muskegon County, the case was unfamiliar history. Many had not even been born when Rebecca was killed. For older residents, the announcement reopened memories that had never completely disappeared. Newspapers, once again, carried her photograph. Television stations revisited footage and interviews connected to the original investigation. The phrase cold case returned to headlines, this time accompanied by something that had been missing for decades. Progress. Communities often react to cold case arrests with mixed emotions. There is relief that investigators never gave up. There is sorrow because the crime happened at all. There is amazement that modern science can reach so far into the past. And there is a sobering realization for anyone who has ever believed time alone can erase accountability. The Bletch investigation had become another reminder that some evidence grows more powerful with age. Law enforcement agencies across the country followed developments closely. The case reflected a broader transformation occurring throughout forensic science. Cold cases, once considered impossible, were increasingly returning to active prosecution because investigators decades earlier had preserved evidence with remarkable foresight. Every successful case reinforced the same lesson. Protect everything. Document everything. Assume future technology will exceed today's imagination. The detectives who worked the original crime scene in 1989 could not have predicted forensic genetic genealogy. They could not have envisioned laboratory techniques capable of extracting meaningful DNA profiles from samples once considered inadequate. Yet their careful work made those future breakthroughs possible. Professionalism bridged generations. Investigators separated by 30 years had unknowingly become partners in the same homicide investigation. One generation collected, another interpreted. Together, they accomplished what neither could have achieved alone. As prosecutors finalized preparations, they understood the emotional significance extending beyond legal arguments. For Rebecca's family, this was not merely another criminal case entering the justice system. It represented the possibility that the long silence following her death might finally be broken. No prosecution could restore the years stolen from her loved ones. No verdict could return birthdays missed, holidays altered forever, or the ordinary moments interrupted by unimaginable violence. Justice, even when delayed, remains incomplete. Yet accountability carries its own importance. It affirms that victims are remembered, that investigations matter, that persistence has value. The legal process ahead promised to be closely watched. Every motion filed, every evidentiary hearing, every courtroom appearance. The case would be examined not only because of its age, but because it demonstrated how dramatically criminal investigations had evolved over the course of a generation. For investigators, however, publicity remained secondary. Their responsibility was unchanged from the day the homicide occurred. Follow the evidence. Protect the integrity of the investigation. Allow facts, not headlines, to determine the outcome. After more than 30 years, the investigation had traveled from a quiet Michigan roadway to the threshold of a courtroom. The evidence had survived. The science had advanced. The suspect had been identified. What remained was the ultimate test of every homicide investigation, not whether investigators believed they had solved the case, but whether the evidence they had preserved, across 3 decades, could withstand the scrutiny of the American justice system and finally provide the answers that had eluded an entire community for more than a generation. When a murder case returns to public attention after more than 30 years, it no longer belongs only to investigators and prosecutors. It belongs to history. Reporters revisit yellowed newspaper archives. Television stations compare footage separated by generations. People who once followed every development as young adults now watch new updates as grandparents. The passage of time changes everyone except the victim. In every photograph released to the public, Rebecca Bletch remained forever 26 years old. That contrast was impossible to ignore. The suspect had grown older. Witnesses had grown older. Detectives had retired. Some had passed away. Entire neighborhoods had changed. Yet Rebecca's image remained frozen in the summer of 1989, a permanent reminder of the life interrupted on a quiet Michigan roadway. As the prosecution prepared its case, investigators continued reviewing every aspect of the evidence, not because they doubted their conclusions, but because the stakes demanded absolute confidence. A homicide trial is not won by dramatic moments. It is won through preparation. Every document must be authentic. Every forensic procedure must be reproducible. Every witness must be credible. Every timeline must withstand intense cross-examination. Defense attorneys in cold case prosecutions frequently focus on one unavoidable reality: time. Time erodes memory. Time destroys evidence. Time complicates reconstruction. Time raises questions that would never exist in a recent investigation. Prosecutors anticipated every one of those arguments. They understood that the age of the case could be portrayed as a weakness. Their responsibility was to demonstrate that, in this investigation, time had strengthened rather than weakened the evidence. The most compelling example remained the DNA. Unlike eyewitness testimony, genetic evidence does not become less reliable because decades have passed. If preserved correctly, biological material remains scientifically valuable. In fact, advances in forensic technology often allow laboratories to recover information that earlier generations simply could not detect. The evidence itself had remained unchanged. Only humanity's ability to interpret it had evolved. That distinction became central to the prosecution's preparation. Investigators also worked carefully to reconstruct the original investigative process. Jurors would need to understand that the case had not been ignored for 30 years. It had never been abandoned. Detectives from multiple generations had reviewed evidence repeatedly. Laboratory testing had continued whenever new technology became available. Leads had been followed. Witnesses had been re-interviewed. Public appeals had been renewed. The investigation represented persistence, not neglect. That persistence reflected an important truth shared by experienced homicide investigators. Cold cases are rarely solved because someone suddenly works harder. They are solved because determination meets opportunity. Opportunity arrives in many forms: a forgotten witness, a newly discovered document, an unexpected confession, or a scientific breakthrough that changes what evidence can reveal. The Rebecca Bletch investigation belonged firmly within that final category. Forensic science had accomplished what decades of conventional investigation could not. Still, investigators never allowed science to exist in isolation. They examined the suspect's behavior before and after the murder as carefully as circumstances allowed. Did his known movements correspond with established timelines? Were there inconsistencies in historical statements? Did archived records support or contradict investigative conclusions? Every answer required documentation. Speculation held no value. Only verified facts mattered. Meanwhile, journalists began exploring the broader significance of the case. Across the country, law enforcement agencies had increasingly relied upon advanced DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy to reopen murders once believed unsolvable. The Bletch investigation became another example of that transformation. Experts interviewed by news organizations described the extraordinary evolution of forensic science over the previous 3 decades. What had once required relatively large biological samples could now be accomplished using remarkably small quantities of preserved material. Analytical software had become dramatically more sophisticated. Laboratory quality assurance procedures had continued improving. Genetic genealogy had introduced entirely new investigative possibilities. The public fascination with these developments reflected something deeper than scientific curiosity. People wanted reassurance. They wanted to believe that justice remained possible regardless of how much time had passed. For families living with unresolved loss, each newly solved cold case represented more than another headline. It represented hope. The Bletch family had lived through that emotional uncertainty for more than 30 years. Hope had appeared before. It had faded before. Investigators remained careful not to promise outcomes beyond what evidence could support. Professional caution protected everyone involved. As legal proceedings advanced, prosecutors assembled expert witnesses capable of explaining complex forensic concepts without overwhelming jurors. Scientific accuracy had to coexist with clarity. Terms familiar inside forensic laboratories often mean little to ordinary citizens. Experts would need to explain probabilities, laboratory procedures, chain of custody, contamination safeguards, and DNA interpretation using language understandable to individuals without scientific training. That educational role has become increasingly important in modern criminal trials. Technology can appear almost magical when poorly explained. Good expert witnesses remove mystery. They demonstrate methods. They explain limitations. They acknowledge uncertainty where it exists. Their credibility depends upon objectivity rather than advocacy. The prosecution expected that defense experts might challenge aspects of the forensic analysis. Such disagreements are common. Science advances through scrutiny. Courtrooms function similarly. Competing experts examine methodologies, statistical calculations, laboratory procedures, and interpretation. The objective is not theatrical confrontation. It is rigorous examination. Strong scientific conclusions survive because they can be independently verified. Outside the courtroom, members of the community reflected on how profoundly the world had changed since 1989. Back then, mobile phones were uncommon. The internet barely existed in public life. Security cameras were rare. Digital records were limited. Today, investigators routinely analyze surveillance footage, GPS data, mobile device records, social media activity, and electronic transactions. Had Rebecca been killed in the modern era, detectives might have possessed thousands of additional investigative leads within hours. Instead, investigators relied upon painstaking fieldwork, interviews, physical evidence, and patience. That reality highlighted the remarkable foresight of those who processed the original crime scene. They preserved evidence without knowing how future generations would use it. Every carefully sealed package became an investment in possibilities science had not yet invented. Experienced investigators often describe evidence as a conversation between generations. One generation collects. Another interprets. A third may ultimately solve the case. The Bletch investigation illustrated that principle with extraordinary clarity. No single detective deserved exclusive credit. No single laboratory created the breakthrough. Justice emerged through decades of cumulative effort. Patrol officers who secured the crime scene. Crime scene technicians who documented every detail. Evidence custodians who preserved materials year after year. Laboratory scientists who revisited samples repeatedly. Cold case detectives who refused to let the investigation disappear. Genealogists who reconstructed family histories. Prosecutors who assembled the legal case. Each contribution depended upon every contribution that came before it. The investigation became a testament to institutional memory. Cases survive because people care enough to preserve them. For Rebecca's loved ones, however, institutional success could never erase personal loss. Justice and grief exist side by side. One does not replace the other. Family members who had spent decades wondering whether answers would ever come now faced an entirely different emotional challenge. preparing to hear evidence presented publicly, listening as investigators reconstructed the final known moments of someone they loved, watching strangers examine the most painful chapter of their lives. Trials often reopen wounds long before they provide closure. Even so, many families choose to attend every hearing. Presence itself becomes an act of remembrance, a declaration that the victim has never been forgotten. As preparations continued, one truth became increasingly apparent. The investigation had already changed criminal justice in one important way. It demonstrated that patience combined with scientific progress could overcome obstacles once considered insurmountable. For future offenders, that message carried unmistakable significance. Escaping immediate identification no longer guaranteed permanent anonymity. Evidence collected today might reveal its secrets decades later. Technology would continue advancing. Laboratories would continue improving. Investigators would continue asking new questions of old evidence. The passage of time, once regarded as an ally of the guilty, had gradually become one of law enforcement's greatest advantages. Somewhere within the carefully organized prosecution files lay every piece of that remarkable journey. The first frantic reports from July 1989. The crime scene diagrams. The witness interviews. The laboratory analyses. The decades of unanswered questions. And finally, the scientific breakthrough that transformed an unidentified DNA profile into the name of a suspect. The investigation had traveled farther than anyone standing beside that rural Michigan roadway could have imagined. But the most consequential chapter was still ahead, because evidence gathered over more than 3 decades would soon face its greatest challenge, not inside a forensic laboratory, not within an investigative office, but in a courtroom where every fact would be tested, every conclusion questioned, and the pursuit of justice would ultimately depend upon whether 12 ordinary citizens believed that the silent witness preserved since 1989 had finally spoken with unmistakable certainty. Courtrooms are designed to separate certainty from assumption. They are places where emotion is acknowledged but never allowed to replace evidence, where every claim must survive scrutiny, and where decades of investigative work can ultimately depend upon a handful of carefully chosen words spoken under oath. For the investigators who had carried the Rebecca Bletch case across generations, reaching the stage represented neither victory nor closure. It represented accountability. Every decision made since July 1989 would now be examined in public. The prosecution began assembling a chronological narrative built almost entirely from verifiable facts. The timeline started on that summer morning. It followed Rebecca's known movements. It documented the discovery of the crime scene. It traced the collection of physical evidence. It explained the limitations investigators faced in 1989. Then, step by step, it demonstrated how advances in forensic science transformed evidence that had remained preserved for more than 3 decades. The story was remarkable precisely because it required no embellishment. Reality was compelling enough. Jurors would eventually learn that the biological evidence recovered during the original investigation had never lost its importance. It had simply outlived the technology available to interpret it. Every year that passed brought improvements in laboratory science. Every new generation of forensic techniques expanded the amount of information that investigators could recover from preserved samples. Time had not erased the evidence. Time had strengthened its voice. Forensic experts prepared detailed presentations explaining exactly how the DNA profile had been developed and verified. The objective was not simply to persuade. It was to educate. Most jurors enter a courtroom without formal scientific training. They hear terms such as genetic markers, statistical probability, extraction methods, quality assurance, and chain of custody without fully appreciating what those concepts mean. Experts therefore focused on clarity. Every laboratory procedure had been documented. Every analysis had been independently reviewed. Every conclusion rested upon established scientific standards rather than experimental theory. The prosecution also emphasized another important point. The DNA evidence had not appeared suddenly after 30 years. The biological material had existed from the very beginning. Investigators in 1989 had preserved it because they understood that future scientific developments might reveal answers unavailable at the time. That decision demonstrated remarkable foresight. It also reinforced the credibility of the investigation. Nothing had been manufactured. Nothing had been recreated. The evidence had remained continuously preserved. Defense attorneys, as expected, examined every stage of the investigation with equal intensity. That is their responsibility. The adversarial system depends upon rigorous testing of evidence. Every forensic conclusion, every witness statement, every investigative decision. Nothing is accepted simply because law enforcement believes it to be true. Strong cases survive precisely because they withstand difficult questions. The age of the investigation inevitably became part of those questions. How reliable were memories after more than 30 years? Could witnesses still accurately recall events? Had investigative assumptions evolved over time? Could scientific advances unintentionally introduce new uncertainties? These were legitimate issues for any court to consider. Prosecutors answered by returning repeatedly to the same principle. The case was not built upon memory alone. It was anchored by preserved physical evidence. Witness recollections helped establish context. Documents reconstructed timelines. Scientific analysis provided objective support independent of human recollection. Throughout the proceedings, Rebecca remained at the center of the story. Not as a symbol, not merely as a victim, but as a young woman whose life had ended without warning. Family photographs presented a person rather than a case file. Friends and relatives described ordinary moments, simple routines, shared laughter, future plans interrupted forever. These details reminded everyone inside the courtroom why the investigation had endured for so many years. Cold case prosecutions are not exercises in historical curiosity. They exist because someone's absence continues to matter. Outside the courthouse, public interest remained high. Local residents who had followed the case since 1989 discussed each new development. Many expressed admiration for the investigators who had refused to let the file disappear. Others found themselves reflecting on how profoundly forensic science had changed criminal investigations. Across the country, similar stories continued emerging. Cases once believed permanently unsolved were reaching courtrooms because preserved evidence had gained new significance through advancing technology. The Bletch investigation became part of that broader transformation. Law enforcement agencies increasingly invested in reviewing archived evidence from older homicides. Evidence rooms once viewed as repositories of forgotten cases became sources of new opportunity. Detectives who specialized in cold cases often described themselves as caretakers rather than discoverers. Their task was not to invent new evidence. It was to recognize new possibilities within evidence that already existed. The Rebecca Bletch investigation illustrated that philosophy perfectly. The answers had not been created. They had been uncovered. As testimony continued, investigators explained the painstaking process of reopening the case. Every major decision required documentation. Every new forensic examination followed established protocols. Genealogical research, where applicable to the investigation, served as an investigative lead rather than proof of guilt. It helped narrow the field of inquiry, but the prosecution relied upon independently verified evidence when presenting its case. That distinction was essential. Modern forensic investigations frequently combine traditional detective work with advanced scientific methods. Neither replaces the other. Scientific analysis points investigators in a direction. Conventional investigation confirms or refutes what science suggests. The strongest cases emerge when both reach the same conclusion. The emotional weight of the proceedings extended far beyond legal arguments. For retired detectives, the trial represented the culmination of careers spent chasing unanswered questions. Some had worked the original investigation. Others had inherited it years later. Many never expected to see the case reach this point. They understood better than anyone how easily cold cases can fade from public attention. This one never did. Its persistence reflected the determination of countless individuals separated by decades but united by a common purpose. For younger investigators, the case became a lesson in professional responsibility. Crime scenes must be documented thoroughly. Evidence must be preserved meticulously. Reports must be written carefully. No one can predict which seemingly insignificant detail will become decisive 30 years later. The investigation served as a reminder that today's routine procedures may become tomorrow's breakthrough. That lesson extended beyond law enforcement. Communities also learned something important. Justice is not measured solely by speed. Immediate arrests are ideal, but delayed accountability still matters. Every successful cold case prosecution challenges the assumption that time protects offenders. Instead, it demonstrates the opposite. Scientific progress continues. Investigative techniques improve. Databases expand. Questions that cannot be answered today may become solvable tomorrow. For families still waiting in other unsolved cases, that message carries profound significance. Hope does not guarantee resolution, but neither does the passage of decades guarantee permanent silence. As the proceedings advanced, one truth became increasingly clear. No courtroom could return Rebecca to the people who loved her. No verdict could erase the years of uncertainty. No sentence could restore birthdays, anniversaries, or conversations that never happened. Justice has limits. It cannot reverse history. What it can do is acknowledge truth through evidence. It can recognize the value of persistence. It can affirm that victims are remembered even when investigations span generations. In the end, the Rebecca Bletch case stood as more than the story of one homicide. It became a demonstration of how patience, careful evidence preservation, and scientific advancement can converge across decades to answer questions once thought impossible to resolve. The quiet Michigan roadway where the investigation began had changed with the passing years. Trees had grown. Road surfaces had been repaired. Traffic came and went without noticing the history beneath its wheels. Yet because investigators refused to surrender the search for answers, that ordinary stretch of road would no longer be remembered only as the place where a life was taken. It would also be remembered as the place where evidence waited, year after year, until science finally became capable of revealing the truth hidden within it. For more than 30 years, the name Rebecca Bletch represented a question without an answer. It existed in police files, newspaper archives, and the memories of people who had watched an entire generation pass while the mystery remained unresolved. But when the investigation finally reached the courtroom, the focus shifted from what was unknown to what could be proven. Cold cases are often remembered for the moment they are solved. But behind every solved case are years of invisible work. Thousands of hours. Countless decisions. Investigators who continued reviewing evidence long after headlines disappeared. Scientists who examined samples that had been collected before some of them were even born. Families who carried grief through decades of unanswered questions. The public often sees the final breakthrough. Few people see the long road that made that breakthrough possible. The prosecution's case centered on a simple but powerful idea. The evidence collected in 1989 had survived. The technology of 1989 had not been enough. But the future had arrived. The courtroom became the place where those two realities finally met. Jurors heard how investigators originally responded to the crime scene. They learned about the urgency of those first hours when detectives were attempting to capture every possible detail before the passage of time could destroy valuable information. Crime scenes are moments that never happen twice. Weather changes. People move through the area. Nature alters the landscape. Objects disappear. Memories fade. That is why the first response is so critical. In 1989, investigators documented the scene with the tools available at the time. They photographed locations, collected evidence, interviewed witnesses, and preserved items that might someday become significant. They could not know which pieces would matter decades later. They could only follow the principles of good investigation. Collect everything. Document everything. Assume every detail may someday answer a question. That philosophy became the foundation of the eventual breakthrough. During testimony, forensic specialists explained how preserved biological evidence could provide answers that investigators in the late 20th century could not have imagined. DNA science had undergone a transformation. Early forensic testing often required substantial biological material and produced limited information. Modern techniques could examine smaller samples with greater sensitivity and accuracy. The difference was revolutionary. Evidence, once considered merely supportive, could now become identifying. A tiny biological trace could reveal an individual connection with extraordinary statistical confidence. For jurors, understanding the significance of that transformation was essential. The prosecution carefully explained that the DNA evidence was not a conclusion based on one isolated laboratory result. It was the product of a process: collection, preservation, testing, verification, comparison, statistical interpretation. Each stage contributed to the final conclusion. The defense, meanwhile, challenged the interpretation of the evidence. That challenge was expected. Scientific evidence, despite its power, must always be examined critically. The courtroom is designed for that purpose. Experts were questioned about laboratory procedures. They were asked about possible sources of error. They explained safeguards designed to prevent contamination and ensure reliability. Every answer became part of the larger evaluation. The jury was not asked to believe science simply because it sounded complicated. They were asked to understand why the scientific conclusions were reliable. Beyond the laboratory findings, prosecutors presented the investigative path that led authorities to the suspect. The process demonstrated how modern investigations increasingly combine technology with traditional detective work. DNA alone did not walk investigators to a courtroom. It created a direction. Detectives still had to verify identity. They still had to reconstruct timelines. They still had to examine historical records and eliminate alternative explanations. This distinction mattered because criminal investigations are not built on possibilities. They are built on proof. Every step required confirmation. Every assumption required testing. Every theory had to survive attempts to disprove it. That careful approach reflected decades of lessons learned from previous cold case investigations. Investigators knew that the excitement of a breakthrough could become dangerous if it encouraged shortcuts. The goal was not simply to identify someone. The goal was to establish the truth in a way that could withstand legal examination. For Rebecca's family, watching the case unfold publicly created emotions that were impossible to describe. There was relief that the investigation had finally reached this stage. There was pain in hearing details of the crime again. There was anger over the years lost waiting for answers. There was sadness knowing that no legal proceeding could restore the life that had been taken. Families of homicide victims often describe justice as something complicated. It is not a replacement for the person they lost. It is not the end of grief. Instead, it is recognition. Recognition that the victim mattered. Recognition that the crime mattered. Recognition that the search for truth was worth continuing. The courtroom also became a place where generations of investigators were connected. Some detectives involved in the original case were no longer active. Some had retired years earlier. But their work remained visible. The reports they wrote, the evidence they preserved, the decisions they made under pressure, all of it contributed to the final outcome. Cold case investigations often belong to no single person. They are passed from one investigator to another like a responsibility carried through time. One detective collects the first clue. Another notices a forgotten detail. A scientist applies a new technique. A prosecutor builds the legal argument. A jury ultimately decides. Justice becomes a chain, and every link matters. The case also highlighted the changing relationship between law enforcement and forensic science. In earlier generations, detectives often relied heavily on interviews, eyewitness accounts, and investigative instincts. Those tools remain important. But modern investigations increasingly depend on combining human judgment with scientific analysis. The best results come when both work together. Science can identify. Detectives can explain. Evidence can reveal. Investigators can provide context. Neither exists effectively without the other. As testimony continued, another theme became impossible to ignore. The passage of time had not protected the person responsible. It had only delayed the moment when evidence could be understood. For decades, the investigation appeared frozen. But beneath the surface, progress was occurring. Laboratories improved. Databases expanded. Investigators developed new strategies. Technology advanced. The case was not forgotten. It was waiting. That reality changed the way many people viewed unsolved crimes. Cold cases were no longer simply stories of failure. They became stories of patience. They represented investigations paused by the limits of their era but carried forward by future generations. The Rebecca Bletch case became one of those examples. It demonstrated that justice does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it arrives after years of uncertainty. Sometimes it arrives after families have nearly stopped expecting answers. Sometimes it arrives because someone preserved a piece of evidence that seemed ordinary at the time. The most powerful witness in the case was not a person. It was something collected silently more than 30 years earlier. A trace left behind. A biological signature. A fragment of information that remained unchanged while everything else around it transformed. As the trial moved forward, the central question was no longer whether modern technology could solve old crimes. That question had already been answered. The real question was whether the evidence, after surviving decades of waiting, would finally provide the accountability that Rebecca's family and the community had been seeking since that summer morning in 1989. Because behind every forensic breakthrough is a human story. Behind every laboratory result is a victim. And behind every cold case is a family still waiting for the world to acknowledge what they have always known. That someone was taken. That someone was responsible. And that the truth, no matter how long it takes, has a way of finding its way back into the light. The courtroom had become the final destination of a journey that began on a quiet Michigan roadway more than 3 decades earlier. For years, the investigation existed in uncertainty. It lived in unanswered questions, incomplete theories, and evidence that seemed to hold secrets beyond the reach of the technology available at the time. But now, after decades of waiting, every piece of the investigation was being placed under the brightest possible light. The public wanted a simple answer. Who was responsible? But inside the courtroom, the process was far more complicated. Justice is not built on suspicion. It is not built on rumors. It is not built on the emotional desire for an ending. It is built on evidence strong enough to survive challenge. That standard was the reason the investigation had taken so long to reach this point. Detectives could not simply identify a person and declare the case solved. They had to prove that the identification was accurate. They had to demonstrate that the evidence was reliable. They had to reconstruct the events surrounding Rebecca Bletch's death in a way that left no reasonable explanation unanswered. Every piece of information collected over the decades became part of that reconstruction. The original crime scene, the forensic examinations, the witness accounts, the historical records, the modern DNA analysis. Together, they created a timeline stretching from the summer of 1989 to the courtroom, where the case was finally being examined. For investigators, this was the moment when years of quiet work became visible. The public saw the conclusion. They did not see the thousands of hours spent reviewing old documents. They did not see detectives sitting alone late at night reading reports written by officers who had long since retired. They did not see laboratory scientists carefully analyzing evidence that had waded through 3 decades of technological change. Cold case investigations are often described as mysteries, but solving them is rarely mysterious. It is persistence. It is discipline. It is the willingness to examine the same evidence again and again until the right question is finally asked. The testimony surrounding the forensic evidence became one of the most important parts of the proceedings. Experts explained how DNA analysis had transformed the investigation. They described how biological material recovered decades earlier could still provide reliable information when properly preserved. They explained that DNA does not identify a person because of one single feature. Instead, it relies on comparing multiple genetic markers and calculating the statistical likelihood of a match. The science was complex, but the conclusion was clear. The biological evidence connected the suspect to the crime scene. For the jury, understanding the reliability of that conclusion became essential. The defense challenged the interpretation and emphasized the difficulties created by the passage of time. More than 30 years had passed. People's memories had changed. The original investigation occurred in a different technological era. The defense argued that every possibility needed to be examined carefully. And they were right about one thing. Every possibility does need to be examined. That is how the justice system functions. A fair trial does not assume guilt because investigators believe they have the right person. It requires the evidence to prove it. The prosecution responded by emphasizing the strength of multiple independent findings. The case was not based on one witness remembering a conversation from 1989. It was not based on a single uncertain observation. It relied heavily on physical evidence preserved from the original investigation. Evidence that could be scientifically examined. Evidence that could be tested. Evidence that could be challenged and verified. That difference became central. Human memory can weaken. Documents can be lost. Stories can change. But properly preserved biological evidence remains capable of revealing information decades later. As testimony continued, the courtroom became a place where the past and present collided. The investigation of 1989 met the science of the modern era. The handwritten notes of detectives from another generation met computer-based analysis. Old photographs met digital enhancement. Archived evidence met advanced laboratory techniques. The case represented a bridge between two worlds, one where investigators relied primarily on traditional methods, and another where technology could uncover details invisible to previous generations. For many law enforcement professionals watching the case, that transformation carried a powerful message. Never underestimate old evidence. A piece of material that seems insignificant today may become the key to solving tomorrow's impossible case. That lesson has reshaped how police departments handle unsolved investigations. Evidence storage has become more sophisticated. Cold case units have expanded. Agencies have invested in reviewing older files with modern tools. Because every unresolved case represents someone waiting. Someone who deserves answers. The emotional weight of the proceedings remained especially significant for Rebecca's family. For decades, they had lived with a question that never disappeared. Not knowing who was responsible created a wound that time could not heal. They had experienced the unique pain shared by families of unsolved homicide victims. The world continues moving forward. Children grow up. Families change. New memories are created. But one moment remains frozen forever. The moment when someone they loved was taken away. The eventual identification of a suspect could not undo that loss. Nothing could, but it represented something equally important. Acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that Rebecca's life mattered. That her death was not forgotten. That the search for answers continued even when decades passed. Cold case victims are sometimes reduced to names in investigative files. But every name represents an entire world that once existed. A person with dreams. A person with relationships. A person whose future was stolen. The courtroom restored some of that humanity by placing Rebecca back at the center of the story. Not the evidence. Not the technology. Not the investigation. Her. The woman whose life created the reason for everything that followed. As the trial progressed, the significance of the case extended beyond one family and one community. It became another example of how modern forensic science is changing the definition of time. For generations, criminals believed that surviving the first days after a murder meant surviving forever. The evidence available in 1989 may not have been enough. The investigators of that era may not have had the tools. But the future was always approaching. And the future brought new ways to uncover the truth. The case also revealed an uncomfortable reality. Technology can solve the mystery of identity, but it cannot always answer every question. Even after a suspect is identified, families may still wonder about motive. They may still ask why their loved one was chosen. They may still search for meaning in a senseless act. Those questions belong to a different category. Science can tell investigators who. It cannot always explain why. That human mystery often remains long after the legal process ends. For detectives, however, one fundamental objective had been achieved. The unknown had become known. The person who existed only as an unidentified presence in the evidence file now had an identity. A name replaced a question mark. A face replaced a shadow. The investigation that began with uncertainty now had direction. But even after the breakthrough, the story remained larger than one arrest. It was about the power of preservation, the importance of persistence, the connection between generations of investigators, and the idea that justice can survive even the longest silence. Because 30 years is a long time. Long enough for people to believe a case is forgotten. Long enough for someone to believe consequences will never arrive. But evidence does not forget. And investigators who refuse to surrender can transform decades of uncertainty into a moment of truth. The road where Rebecca Bletch was found no longer represented only tragedy. It represented something else. A reminder that even when answers seem impossible, they may still be waiting. Hidden inside evidence. Preserved by time. Waiting for the moment when science, determination, and justice finally meet. For 30 years, the name Rebecca Bletch existed in a painful space between memory and mystery. Her family remembered a daughter, a mother, a wife, and a person whose future had been stolen. Investigators remembered a case file that refused to close. The community remembered a crime that had shattered the feeling of safety along quiet Michigan roads. But now, after decades of unanswered questions, the investigation had reached the moment every cold case detective hopes to see. The evidence had survived. The science had advanced. The truth had finally moved closer to the surface. Yet solving a decades-old murder is not only about identifying the person responsible. It is also about understanding how the investigation traveled from uncertainty to accountability. It is about recognizing the chain of decisions that allowed justice to remain possible after so much time had passed. The story began with a tragedy, but it continued because people refused to let that tragedy become forgotten history. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors presented the case not as a single dramatic revelation, but as a collection of carefully connected facts. The jury was asked to examine the entire picture. Not one piece. Not one moment. Everything. The physical evidence. The investigative timeline. The forensic conclusions. The circumstances surrounding the crime. The years of work that transformed an unidentified profile into a specific individual. Every element mattered. Cold cases are often difficult because the passage of time creates distance. The victim's world changes. The investigation changes. The people involved change. But evidence creates a bridge between past and present. The DNA recovered in 1989 connected two different eras. It connected the investigators who stood at the original crime scene with the scientists who examined the evidence decades later. It connected the questions of the past with the answers of the present. That connection became the foundation of the prosecution's argument. The defense continued to challenge the case, reminding the courtroom that decades had passed between the crime and the trial. They questioned whether every conclusion drawn from old evidence could be trusted. They examined investigative decisions. They challenged interpretations. They emphasized that every accused person has the right to a full and fair defense. That principle remained essential. The importance of a cold case prosecution is not simply that an arrest occurs. It is that the evidence is strong enough to withstand the highest level of scrutiny. The same passage of time that complicated the investigation also tested the reliability of the evidence. If the case survived those challenges, it demonstrated something powerful. That careful preservation and modern science can overcome obstacles once considered impossible. Forensic experts returned repeatedly to the same central explanation. The evidence was not created by modern technology. The technology simply revealed what had already existed. The biological material had been present since the day investigators collected it. The information had been hidden, not absent. That distinction represented the heart of modern forensic advancement. Science does not rewrite history. It uncovers details history already contained. Beyond the laboratory, investigators examined the human side of the case. The years following Rebecca's death had created countless moments when the investigation could have disappeared. Budgets changed. Personnel changed. Priorities shifted. New crimes demanded attention. Yet the case remained alive. Detectives continued preserving records. Families continued asking questions. Communities continued remembering. That persistence became one of the defining characteristics of the investigation. Every solved cold case carries the fingerprints of many people. Some receive public recognition. Many never do. The officers who secured evidence decades earlier rarely imagined that their work would become part of a future breakthrough. The laboratory technicians who carefully stored samples could not predict what technology would eventually accomplish. The investigators who reviewed old files years later could not know whether they would succeed. But each person contributed something essential. Cold case justice is often built by people who never meet. A detective in one decade leaves a foundation for another detective in the next. A scientist develops a method that helps solve a crime committed before that method existed. A family continues speaking about a loved one whose name might otherwise fade. Together, those actions create momentum. The Rebecca Bletch investigation became a reminder that time does not erase responsibility. It only changes the path toward accountability. For many offenders, the passage of decades creates a false sense of security. They believe that because investigators did not identify them quickly, they never will. But modern forensic science has changed that assumption forever. A person can move. A person can age. A person can build an entirely different life. But evidence collected at the scene of a crime can remain waiting. Silent. Patient. Ready. That reality has transformed the way law enforcement approaches unsolved cases. Departments across the country now regularly review older investigations. Cold case detectives examine evidence with techniques unavailable to the original investigators. Cases once considered permanently unresolved are reopened. Not because someone suddenly discovered a magical solution, because science created new opportunities. The investigation also carried a message for communities still waiting for answers in other unsolved cases. Silence does not always mean failure. Sometimes silence means the answer has not yet been discovered. There are thousands of unresolved cases across the world where evidence remains stored, families continue waiting, and investigators continue searching. The Rebecca Bletch case demonstrated why those searches matter. Behind every file number is a human being. Behind every evidence box is a story. Behind every unanswered question is a family hoping someone, somewhere, will continue looking. The emotional impact of the case extended beyond the courtroom. Many residents reflected on the fact that an ordinary morning in their community had become connected to one of the most significant examples of modern cold case investigation. The road where Rebecca was found looked different decades later. The world around it changed. Technology changed. The community changed. But the importance of what happened there remained. For those who knew Rebecca, the case was never about headlines. It was about a person whose life should have continued, a person whose family deserved answers, a person whose story mattered long after the news cameras left. Justice often arrives imperfectly. It arrives late. It arrives after pain has already changed lives forever. It cannot restore what was lost, but it can provide something equally important: truth. The truth that a victim was remembered. The truth that a crime was investigated. The truth that time did not erase accountability. As the legal process moved toward its conclusion, the investigation stood as a powerful example of the relationship between persistence and technology. Neither alone would have been enough. Science without preserved evidence cannot reveal the past. Preserved evidence without scientific advancement may remain silent. But together, they created a path forward. The evidence collected decades earlier finally achieved what investigators had hoped from the beginning. It told its story, not through words, not through memories, not through speculation, through science. And after more than 30 years of waiting, the question that had haunted a community since the summer of 1989 finally had an answer. The unknown presence connected to the crime was no longer hidden behind time. The investigation had crossed the distance between past and present. The silence had been broken. But for everyone connected to the case, one final reality remained. A solved case does not erase a tragedy. It does not return the years that were lost. It does not undo the pain carried by those left behind. Instead, it represents something different. A promise fulfilled. A commitment kept. A reminder that even after decades pass, some questions are too important to leave unanswered. And sometimes, the smallest piece of evidence can carry the weight of an entire lifetime of waiting. For more than 30 years, a single question remained suspended over a quiet corner of Michigan. Who was responsible for the death of Rebecca Bletch? It was a question asked by detectives, by neighbors, by journalists, and most painfully, by a family forced to live with uncertainty for decades. The years brought new technology, new investigators, and new methods of searching for answers. But through every change, one thing remained constant. Rebecca was never forgotten. The investigation that began with confusion and heartbreak eventually became a story about persistence, scientific progress, and the enduring power of evidence. It became proof that a case can survive even when time appears to be working against it. The world changed dramatically between 1989 and the moment modern forensic science reopened the investigation. The tools available to detectives transformed. The way evidence was analyzed transformed. The way investigators searched for answers transformed. But the purpose never changed. Find the truth. Protect the victim's memory. Hold the responsible person accountable. That purpose carried the investigation across generations. The final chapters of the case were not written by one person or one discovery. They were created through decades of effort. The investigators who first arrived at the scene could not have known that the evidence they collected would one day become the foundation of a breakthrough. They worked with the knowledge and technology available to them, doing what every investigator hopes to do during the first hours of a homicide. Preserve the truth. Capture the details. Leave a path for the future. That path remained open. Years later, when forensic science reached a new level of sophistication, investigators returned to evidence that had been waiting patiently inside storage. The breakthrough was not the result of luck. It was the result of preparation meeting opportunity. Modern technology provided the ability. Decades of careful evidence preservation provided the opportunity. Together, they transformed an impossible question into an answer. The significance of the case extended far beyond one courtroom. It represented a turning point in how society views unsolved crimes. For many years, a cold case was often seen as a tragedy without a solution. A file that had grown old. A mystery that had survived too long. But advances in forensic science changed that perception. Old evidence was no longer simply evidence from the past. It became evidence waiting for the future. Every sealed package inside an evidence room carried potential. Every forgotten report could contain a detail that mattered. Every photograph could reveal something investigators were unable to see decades earlier. The Rebecca Blech investigation became another powerful reminder that time does not always protect those responsible for terrible crimes. Sometimes time becomes the reason they are eventually discovered. Because while memories fade and people move on, physical evidence remains. Technology continues advancing. Investigators continue learning. New generations continue asking questions that previous generations could not answer. That is the foundation of modern cold case investigation. Never assume a case is truly over. Never assume an unanswered question will remain unanswered forever. For Rebecca's family, however, the conclusion of the investigation represented more than scientific achievement. It represented a moment they had waited for across an entire generation. For decades, they carried a pain that few people can understand. The loss itself was devastating. The uncertainty made it even more difficult. When a loved one is taken by violence, families often face two separate battles. The first is learning how to live without that person. The second is living without knowing why. Every unanswered question creates another burden. Every anniversary brings memories of what should have been. Every milestone carries a reminder of who is missing. A solved case cannot erase those years. It cannot bring back the conversations that never happened. It cannot restore the future Rebecca should have experienced. But it can provide something important. Acknowledgement. It confirms that her life mattered, that her story mattered, that the search for answers mattered. Victims in cold cases are sometimes reduced to names attached to old investigations. But Rebecca was more than a case number. She was a person. Someone loved. Someone remembered. Someone whose absence shaped the lives of everyone who knew her. The investigation's conclusion also honored the work of those who refused to surrender. Cold case detectives often operate without guarantees. They may spend years following leads that disappear. They may review evidence without knowing whether it will ever provide answers. They may inherit cases started by officers who are no longer alive. Yet they continue because every victim deserves that effort. The Rebecca Blech case demonstrated the importance of that commitment. The detectives who revisited the investigation years later were not simply solving a crime. They were continuing a promise made decades earlier. A promise that the victim would not be forgotten. A promise that unanswered questions would continue to be pursued. A promise that justice would remain possible. The case also delivered a warning to anyone who believes time creates permanent protection. Decades may pass. Technology may change. Communities may forget details. But evidence can remain. A trace left behind can become a voice from the past. A small piece of biological material can travel across generations and reveal what happened when no one else could. That is the extraordinary power of modern forensic science. It does not replace traditional investigation. It completes it. It allows investigators from different eras to work together. The detective collecting evidence in 1989 and the scientist analyzing it decades later become part of the same pursuit. Different people. Different tools. The same mission. Truth. The story of Rebecca Blech is ultimately not only about a crime. It is about endurance. It is about the people who continued searching when answers seemed impossible. It is about science catching up with questions that had waited too long. It is about a community learning that silence does not always mean the truth is gone. Sometimes the truth is simply waiting. Waiting inside evidence. Waiting inside forgotten records. Waiting for someone willing to look again. The road where Rebecca was found will forever carry the memory of what happened there. But it also carries another message. That justice can travel across time. That investigations can survive generations. That victims are not forgotten simply because years pass. And that even the longest-running mysteries can eventually reach the moment when the darkness begins to disappear. More than 3 decades after a young woman lost her life, the investigation that once seemed impossible finally reached its answer. Not because the past changed. Because the future arrived. Science spoke where silence had remained. Evidence revealed what time had hidden. And a case that began with a devastating unanswered question finally became a reminder of one enduring truth. No matter how much time passes, some stories are never truly over until the truth is finally told.